25th, 2005, and we're at the Atlanta History Center in Atlanta, Georgia, as part of the Library of Congress World War II Veterans Project. And we're fortunate to have with us today Mr. William Crawford, who's a native of Atlanta, grew up in Druid Hills, went to Druid Hills High School, the Citadel College, and had a year law school before going into the military, and spent 5 wonderful years in the military fighting in Germany. And he's going to tell us what it was like growing up in Atlanta back in the 20s and 30s, and what the state of the country was then, how he went into the military, and what happened to him then and since then. And we're just delighted to have you with us today, Bill. We appreciate very much you being with us.
Nice to be with you, David.
Go ahead.
Well, as you say, I grew up here in Atlanta and went to Druid Hills School. My parents built a home out on Clifton Road right across from the Druid Hills Golf Course, which is still there, by the way. And it was there that I was raised pretty much. And at that time, we were out in the country. There at Clifton Road behind us was a wooded area that extended all the way back to Decatur, I suppose maybe 3 or 4 miles. And nothing in between, just absolutely nothing except woods. And the Harrison estate it was, which is now the History Center back in behind Clifton Road. The house became important because it was in my mother's name. And at that time, my father, who had been a retail merchant, had retired. He was in his early 40s and had become a speculator in the stock market in 1927-28 during that time. And as was the case with so many people, many speculators, he lost not only everything that he had, but also he owed money. But the one asset that was in the family was the home, which was in Mother's name, and that saw us through the Depression. He became a merchant again out of necessity, and finally was with Sears Roebuck and was out in Dallas, Texas for a while. But Mother kept my brother and me in Atlanta. We went to Druid Hills School, and I'd have to say happily. And finally he did come back to Atlanta to become the manager of the Sears Roebuck store down on Ponce de Leon. At that time it was a mail order store and a retail store, both in that same building, which I think now they call it City Hall East. He managed the retail side of the business. I went to the Citadel for really no good reason at all. Before my family became impoverished, we were over in Charleston and took a Clyde liner ship from Charleston up to New York. And there in Charleston for a day or two, I saw the old Citadel barracks down on Francis Marion Square. The Citadel had been created as an army post. I don't think it was U.S. Army, I think it was more like a militia post during one of the slave rebellions in the 1840s. And those old barracks are still down there. In fact, they're used now for stores and other purposes. But I did go to the Citadel. I really had zero interest in the military, to be quite honest about it. And I succeeded to remain a private during all 4 years. And I had the distinction of graduating a senior private. My roommate, by the way, was from Atlanta. He was Tom Kinnan, Thomas A. Kinnan. And Tom remained in the service after the war and died just last year. He was a retired Major General in the Army. It was a good experience in a lot of ways. And I don't necessarily recommend a military school for young men. Looking back upon it myself, I believe that it is a little bit stultifying to a fella. And also, I think I suffered for many years from a feeling of persons of authority, kind of intimidated by authority, which for me was the bad part of it. I did enjoy it, liked it very much. when I graduated, I was just 20 years old and really had no idea going to the Army anyhow. But I went to the University of Virginia Law School for 1 year, and during that time, in April of 1940, I became commissioned as a second lieutenant in Infantry Reserve. We were told at that time that we probably would have to serve a year's active duty, and it would be a good idea to go ahead and volunteer for it now and get it over with, which I did. I volunteered and went in the Army in September the 18th, 1940. That was about a year and a few months before the war began, with the idea of spending a year and coming out and returning to law school. Well, as we approached the war had begun in 1940. The Germans had invaded Poland actually in 1939. So in 1940, England was hanging on the ropes, and it looked pretty much as though we were going to have to go into the war anyhow. In fact, I think that we were not allowed to leave the service. We were stuck in there, which was okay. And the war began in December of that year, 1941, and in the following year...
Where were you on Pearl Harbor Day?
In Pearl Harbor Day, I was at Fort Bragg,
Do you remember
North Carolina. I remember.
reaction to
Oh
it?
goodness, yes, quite well. I was with I was a lieutenant, second lieutenant in the 39th Infantry of the 9th Infantry Division, which was formed at Fort Bragg. I was one of the original cadre officers, and we trained our men there. By that time, we were full strength in 1941, and in fact, we had been on maneuvers up in the Carolinas and just come back to Fort Bragg when the war began, when Pearl Harbor happened. So during the preceding months, regimental commander told me that he had recommended me to become a regular Army officer, and in the following February of 1942, I was commissioned second lieutenant regular Army, not reserve, but regular Army. I was sent to the 102nd Infantry Division at Camp Maxey, Texas, which again was a brand new division, and again I was a cadre officer there. And at Camp Maxey with the 102nd, I was in the 405th Infantry Regiment. I was a company commander, and during those years I became a captain, and then toward the latter part of it a major, and worked in various capacities. I was regimental operations officer, battalion executive officer, battalion commander. I did about everything you could do in an infantry regiment except command a regiment. We went overseas in 1944. Well, I should back up and say that we were on maneuvers at least once. Yeah, I guess it would have maybe twice on maneuvers down in Louisiana one time. And during that time, I was sent to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas for 3 months to the Command and General Staff School. When I got out of Fort Leavenworth, it was very few months. I became then the regimental supply, transportation, and so forth officer at the S4 of the regiment. I'd been the operations officer when I left Leavenworth, and then I was put into the S4 job when I returned, which was a rather demanding job because I was responsible for providing all of the equipment, making sure all the guys had everything, every spare part that we had to have, things crated up, ready to go. And finally at Fort Dix, I got on the ship and breathed a great sigh of relief because I had absolutely nothing to do for the first time in several months, during which time I sometimes didn't do a whole lot of sleeping. But we sailed across the ocean, and as you may know, there was never a troop ship, American troop ship, sunk crossing the Atlantic, neither in the First World War or the Second World War, which was really remarkable. And the only incident that I remember was some depth charges being dropped somewhere in the convoy. But we went into Cherbourg. And
Well, I want to go back, if you don't mind. 1942, there's just been a book published by Winston Grooms, who's going to speak at the History Center next week. Was a pretty bleak year for the United States and for Europe in terms of the war. Pearl Harbor had ended in December of '41, and then all the British colonies fell in Malaysia, Singapore, Hong Kong, and shortly thereafter in January and February of 42, we lost a lot of troop ships, British ships, in the Java Gulf Sea over there in 1942. We had the Battle of Coral Sea, Midway. Were you aware of all that at the time, where you just wrapped up in your training and being with your...
Oh yes, not only were we aware of it, but there was an ongoing conversation among infantry officers about what had happened, what was happening. And yes, it was looking back upon it, it was a very dismal time. When you read the history, I don't believe at the time we realized probably how bad off we were in the Pacific, as an example. At Pearl Harbor, the entire Pacific fleet was wiped out, except the aircraft carriers, just totally wiped out. At the time that, before Pearl Harbor, the British had been just hanging on until Hitler went into the Soviet Union. So they were there holding on by their fingernails. And in this country, we didn't have any great consensus, any unanimity of belief about taking care of or fighting against fascism, anything of the sort. In fact, the isolationist sentiment was awfully strong in this country. As an example, before Pearl Harbor, I think it was maybe 1 or 2 months before Pearl Harbor, the question of the draft, the compulsory military service, came up in Congress, and it passed by one single vote. And 2 months later, the country was at war. But as for soldiers, as you indicated, we really felt we were I wouldn't say wrapped up, we were so exhausted doing what we were doing on a daily basis. We didn't have a whole lot of time to do a whole lot of worrying about anything beyond what was in our own units. And of course, incidentally, that was true throughout most of the time we were in combat. You just really don't...
Just saw it was immediately around you.
Yeah, that's all that you really realize what's going on. We left Cherbourg by train, and we rode in these old 40s and 8s. If they had in World War I, 40 men or 8 horses type of equipment. Got up into, went up through outside of Paris, through Liege, and around Maastricht, an area of Maastricht. We detrained, and just on the Dutch side of the Dutch-German border, picked up some heavy equipment, vehicles as an example, all of our trucks, and some heavy equipment, our cannons. We had a cannon company, 4 cannons, and we relieved the 2nd Armored Division just across the W-U-R-M River, which is the border between Germany and the Netherlands. And we were in the line, went up into Germany about, a couple of miles, and that was the front line at that time. And 2nd Armored Division pulled out, and we took over their positions. We remained there through October, and in November we attacked, under the British, we were part of the British Army at that time, we attacked toward the Roer River, R-O-E-R, Roer River, which was in fact the last significant obstacle between the German border and the Rhine River in that whole area of the Rhineland. But we attacked toward the Roer River. We never got there, and got badly shot up. We found out later, really after the war, I discovered, we were shot up by 2 German SS Panzer divisions. One of them was the 10th Panzer Division, SS 10th Panzer, and the other one was another Panzer Division, but the designation of which I don't recall. They were moving from the north of what would be an extension of the Rhine, down south through the Rhineland, and their purpose of this move incidentally, they had hit the bridge too far, the airborne landing up there around Arnhem. They had run right into the 10th SS Panzer.
Those are the two divisions that Monty didn't realize were there.
Monty didn't realize they were there, and boy did they get shot up. So after that debacle up there at Arnhem, these Panzer divisions, they were there to get refitted actually. They moved on down toward Luxembourg in that area, and we didn't know it at the time, but nobody knew it. They were moving down to attack through the Ardennes, so they were the divisions that hit us during the Bulge. But they were moving across our front and were diverted to stop us, so we got hit by two different Panzer divisions, which just badly shot us up. I might add here too, our tanks in World War II, people don't understand, we had a Sherman tank, which was a very effective piece of equipment. The Germans, their most numerous and effective tank was a Panther, P-A-N-T-H-E-R, Panther tank. And it could knock out a Sherman tank with great ease. Also, the Germans had in our front some Tiger tanks that were enormous vehicles. I recall one time we had a tank company attached to our regiment, the 405th Infantry, and a regimental commander asked his tank company commander, said, well, now tell me about the disposition of your tanks here in support of us. And the tank commander says, well, I've got them over here to this flank and that flank and in the rear, so and so. And the regimental commander, Colonel Williams, said, well, what about the front? And his tank commander says, I can't get out in the front. He said, there's one Tiger tank out there that can knock out all 17 of my Sherman tanks before I can get off a shot. So our tanks were effective only because we had them in sufficient numbers. But when we ran up against Panthers and Tiger tanks, we didn't have a chance. We had other equipment that was quite obsolete. Our machine guns were from World War II, water-cooled machine gun and also the air-cooled. Tedious piece of equipment, tough to haul around, heavy. Our 81mm mortars were somewhat of an improvement over the old trench mortar of World War II. It wasn't a bad weapon. A couple of things that we had that were very effective. The M1 rifle, the Garand rifle so-called, would shoot 8 rounds. And our soldiers soon learned when in an attack, we'd take off on an attack, that we would move, of course the enemy's shooting at you, and on every 4th step or whatever, a man would get off a round. He wasn't aimed, it was maybe from the hip. Just to put a volume of fire over the heads of a defending German so they could hear the cracks of the bullets going over their heads. They wouldn't be able to put their heads up and take aim and shoot at us. I never had to, at that time, I never had to take off in an attack. I would get shot at, but it would be the company commanders would be the highest ranking guy that would be out there getting shot at. I should say, however, that we had 3 rifle companies, 3 battalions, 9 rifle companies in a regiment. 3,000 men in a regiment, 9 rifle companies. And of our 9 rifle companies, 4 of our company commanders were killed. Among the lieutenants, mostly platoon leaders, about 13% of those were killed. In the entire regiment of 3,000 men, our replacements were about 95% replacements came through during our 6-month period in combat, which is to say that an infantry regiment engaged in combat had about 100% turnover after 6 months. That doesn't mean everybody's killed. Our killed in action probably were somewhere between 10 and 12%. The rest were evacuated wounds, obviously, injuries, sickness, some what they called battle fatigue at that time, shell shock in World War I, probably either anxiety or depression, I think, something like that. And we may have had some few men, we did have men captured. but I don't think anybody ever deserted anything like that. But that's the kind of turnover that occurs in an infantry regiment in 6 months of fighting. Of course, you're not fighting all of those 6 months, but it's in the long periods too, you get awfully bored. But after that experience, and the bulge, everything around us was sent down to the bulge. We were the one division sat out there on a little old salient by ourselves. But happily, the Germans never did take a big swipe at us. They would make some demonstrations as though they were going to come at us, but they really never did in that sector.
What was your first reaction to being fired upon? You remember, you'd never been shot, you were a young guy, you'd been in the military for 3.5 years at that time, but I would imagine the first time you heard a bullet going by, it got your attention.
Well, it does. It does. I don't know that I was ever too upset about it. I didn't much like it, but one of my earliest experiences, after we relieved the 2nd Armored, I went up in one of the rifle companies, and I was walking up a hill, and it was so I was in defilade. Could not be seen by the Germans across the way there, a few hundred yards out. And as I walked along up this road, I was looking for one of the officers. I don't know. And as I kept on walking, I realized that all the enlisted men out there, had some foxholes. They were laying around in the sun and so forth, doing nothing, cleaning weapons. I remember one fellow had a great big overstuffed German chair out of somebody's living room, and he had it by his foxhole. And he had that chair along his foxhole. He had a place of comfort so he could sit and watch them. Anyhow, as I walked up this ridge line, all of these guys were watching me. I just suddenly was aware that these enlisted men kind of standing around and were doing nothing and stopped and were watching me. And then I realized that I had crested the ridge line, and I was under easy observation from across the way. And I was talking about some of the guys afterward, and the regimental commander said, well, that was the way it was in World War I. Said, enlisted men, they'll never say a word. They'll let you walk right into the line. Maybe they just didn't like us too much, I don't know. We took off across the Roar River in March of 1945. And that was a disputed crossing. The Germans held it there, and that was their last defensive position that they had until they got to the Rhine. So they held it they're pretty tough getting across, and we got pretty bad shot up there. And the regiment, by the way, in years later, 1947, a Presidential Unit Citation was awarded, which is not too many of those, awarded to the regiment for that Roar River crossing, because it was a disputed crossing, it was difficult, and we got bad shot up, but we made it. And from there, we drove the Germans back to the Rhine, and they would stop, fight in towns. At that time, they'd fight from towns, little farm villages, and until they held out until they either gave up and surrendered or they pulled out. And they were stalling then as we approached the Rhine to give cover to their own forces that were being evacuated across. We went in at around Krefeld on the Rhine, and that's where the Adolf Hitler Bridge was, and they were evacuating across that bridge. They blew the bridge, of course, and so we spent a couple of weeks there, and then crossed the Rhine up at Weser on the Rhine, and is that right? Vessel, V-E-S-S-E, Vessel on the Rhine, and we followed. It wasn't a combat crossing. The two airborne divisions had dropped, and those airborne divisions were the biggest mess I've ever seen in my life. The gliders, those gliders had come down, crashed all over the place, nose straight down, slam into the ground, weapons and everything. It was just absolutely a total mess, and it was totally unproductive too. We had no need of a glider or a airborne operation there at all. The area had already been taken pretty well. But we pursued the Germans across that Central European plain, and most of the action was rearguard action. They would fight from, in this instance, from the wooded areas and small units. But you get a small unit of, say, a squad or so that got a couple of machine guns out there, and they're shooting at you from a well-concealed position. You got to stop, you got to hold up, you got to bring up your heavy weapons, you got to bring up sometimes your artillery, get your artillery in position. So it was difficult, and these units would quite often be stiffened by a couple of SS men in the units. Now this would be, incidentally, talking about the SS, this would be the Waffen SS, W-A-F-F-E-N, weapons SS. Those were the guys, those were the fighting troops. When you say the 10th Panzer, SS Panzer, that's the Waffen SS. They were not the police, the Gestapo, which were the bad guys, and they were not the Allgemeine SS, who were the local boys, sort of politicians, I guess. But the Waffen SS, toward the end of the war, they were their units were filled up with draftees, but they were splendid soldiers. That was the only complaint we had about the SS, that they were such very effective soldiers, and they'd fight. I remember seeing a line of them out. They had dug in front of us, and we could see the foxholes out there. And we brought up the artillery and shot them all up. And they stayed in those foxholes. They stayed in there and died. And we went by there, here a long line of foxholes, and every foxhole had a dead SS man in it. But they would fight to the very end, so they were formidable people. We got finally to the Elbe River, which is, I guess, a couple hundred miles from the Rhine, and the Germans had stopped fighting us. They pulled back across the river, and I went down with well, first I came in and saw, came in on our command post. It was just, we used a house, somebody's house we moved into. Walked in, and there was a German general and two German majors, and one was a Panzer major, and the other was Wehrmacht. And they were there to negotiate the surrender of I've forgotten what the designation was. It was von Wink's Panzer Army. It was the last field army of the German army. It was the last field army. And they made arrangements to come back the next day so a general officer could come down to deal with him. And next day, another major and I went down to the Elbe River to meet these two Germans. They came across in an amphibious jeep. One of the majors and this lieutenant general, German general, von Edelstein was his name. And we picked them up, took them back to command post, and went through the negotiations for the surrender of that German army. And the Germans asked that they be allowed, this German general, the right of the last shot. And our general officer from division asked what that meant. They said, well, they wanted to be able to continue to fight, to hold off the Russians, so they could evacuate as many of their wounded and civilian across the Elbe to the American side. Well, told them, okay, keep on fighting as long as you want to, but we couldn't take the wounded. I remember the major and the lieutenant general. I went back to the river with him, and I asked that major, German tank major, what are you going to do? And he said, well, he said he had a tank battalion that was charged with protecting the wounded, the German wounded. And he said that the Russians shoot the wounded. And I said, what are you going to do? And he says, I'm going to go back and fight it out. I said, I'll fight to the end. And I guess that's what he did. That we got over, and I had to take, it was part of my job was to take care of everything that came over. Wounded, German troops that were coming across the bridge, although it was down, pedestrian traffic could still come across. Some civilians. We took in that sector about 20,000. I had about 20,000 German POWs, German soldiers, that came across the Elbe River, and we put them out in the field, and I had nothing with which to feed them. Didn't have anything much to feed ourselves, in fact, because we'd outrun our supplies. And so I got the German railroad people together in that little area and cranked up the railroad trains. And I put those German POWs on that railroad train and sent them west, back toward the Rhine. I don't know where they were going to go, but I just put them on that railroad train and started these trains moving. And I cleaned out about 20,000. Actually, I had a lieutenant that did all the loading and so forth for me. But I had them all sent back west.
Just a minute. Go for it.
Well, the Russians came across at that time after we negotiated with the Germans, and we had a party with the Russians, Russian officers, and they were really nice guys. All the combat fellows were nice fellows. They had one officer with them, I recall, whom they described as their recreation and information officer, something like that. And he was the commissar, I guess. But he was the political person for that Guards regiment, Russian Guards regiment. He had the authority to override the regimental commander, who was a major general, override this major general. The political guy couldn't. I think that was true in all the Russian organizations. After that, we were in occupation, so to speak. We were sent south down to, incidentally, there on the Elbe River at Stendal, we ran in, before the war and before we got to the river, I was up with one of the companies, and the company commander, the company had just taken off on an attack into a town called Gardelagen. They were holding up in Gardelagen. And I remember looking down the road, standing down the road, and a vehicle, German vehicle, is a Jeep-like vehicle, Volkswagen, came out with a white flag. And with that, one of the soldiers down the 100 yards or so out was hollering for aid man. One of the lieutenants had been shot, and they brought him back up. His first lieutenant bar on the front of his helmet, a bullet had gone straight in that, as though it couldn't have been aimed, but it was just a bullet right through that little oblong white first lieutenant bar. Of course, hit him in the forehead, and he was dead. But out came some German officers, and they said that they wanted to surrender. Well, I had other things to do, so I went on into Stendal. The regimental commander told me they came out and they broke up their arms and surrendered, which was okay. But we saw a column of smoke. Before I left, I saw a great huge column of smoke coming off. I thought they were burning their stores or vehicles or something. And the next day we found out that was a barn. That had been one of these great huge German storage barns. The SS that ran the PW, their slave labor camps, Gestapo, like police people, from the site at which the V1 rockets were manufactured down in some old abandoned mines down in the mountainous area. They had driven 1,000 displaced persons, slave laborers, up to that area, taking them along because these German prison guards, if they were fleeing the enemy, they'd be promptly shot.
Yeah.
But having these slave laborers, they were ostensibly conducting them back to somewhere else. Well, they took the slave laborers and drove them into, first they took in a barn, they saturated the hay with gasoline, drove the slave laborers, 1,000 of them, into the barn and set the barn on fire. And they burned up 1,000 people there. Then they must have gotten rid of their uniforms or stolen civilian clothes or killed one of the Wehrmacht soldiers and taken his uniform. They weren't above doing that either. But anyhow, after the war we moved down into Thuringia, and that became the Russian territory. We turned that over to the Ruskies, that territory in Thuringia. That's Weimar, Gotha, or what else. And we continued to move south, and I ended up at a town called, outside of a town called Flossenburg, down about a mile from the Czech border. And I had an infantry battalion. I commanded 1st Battalion at that time, and I was in command of a PW camp, which had been a German slave labor camp at Flossenburg. And there, they were all Poles, slave laborers, and they were manufacturing equipment for the German aircraft. I had 5,000 German SS troops, PWs, in my camp. And I think I had about a dozen general officers, SS officers, generals of various ranks. And we never had any problem with the nicest guys in the world, and just good soldiers, damn good soldiers, and they knew what my job was, and I knew what their job was, and we never had any trouble with them at all. But that was my last experience, and after that I came home. I got out. I'd been in the Army for 6 years, and came home, resigned my commission because by that time I'd acquired from somewhere, I don't know where, a wife, and somewhere else I had 2 little girls. I don't know where they ever came from either. But wandering around the world in the Army with 2 children, I didn't think that was a good idea. So I went to work for Merrill Lynch in New York City, and in September 1946. And worked up there for 6-7 months. Actually, it was a training school that they had at Charlie Merrill, who'd been a flyer in World War I, saw the advantage of hiring young officers, junior officers out of the military that the Army, the Air Forces, and so forth had pre-selected for him, had qualified them for him. So we were about 30 of us in the class, and it was wonderful education, unbelievable education. Lectures that we had, you can't imagine some of the great figures of Wall Street. One of them was Earl Browder, the head of the Communist Party, came in one time and talked with us. We had everything. But I went from there, I became a broker, as we would say a broker. At that time they called them account executives, and was sent to Corpus Christi, Texas, lived out there, worked out there for a couple of years, came back here to Atlanta, was a broker in Atlanta for 10 years, became an office manager for Merrill Lynch down in Macon, Georgia for 8 years, then was sent to Memphis as the office manager for 3 years, then came back to Atlanta, and I was the manager here of at that time, both the retail and the institutional offices for, I'm going to say it's 13 years, and I retired in 1984 at age 65, and have lived happily ever afterward.
You married Mary while you were in the military during the war?
Yes, just after the war began. War began in December the 7th, 1941. We were married in February of 1942. And so we've been married 63 years.
That's wonderful. What was it like leaving your wife and leaving your to-be children? Was that hard on you at the time?
Well, I'm sure it was no fun, but I must say that I was so totally exhausted because all of the chore of everything in moving a regiment, and the equipment, and before that I'd been the operations officer. I had to get everybody qualified with every kind of weapon in the division. I had just run myself to death, so I was more worn out than anything else, and was awfully happy to get on that ship and go to sleep for a day or two.
Did you get mail when you were overseas?
Oh yeah, we got mail, pretty much. and fairly good delivery of mail, which is always important to soldiers. We got some reading material. I remember we would get very small copies with no advertising of Time magazine, Newsweek, New Yorker magazine, things like that, that every now and then, it was not too often, which were nice to have. But for the most part, you go up there in the line and you just kind of do what you have to do.
Did you get to take a bath when you were in the front line?
Very seldom. In that area where we first started out in the Rhineland, that's a coal mining area. And the coal miners are provided with great huge shower facilities in the above ground, of course. And they had hot water with the coal they could burn. And so we had hot showers there that we'd send a truckload of maybe a platoon at a time back. They could take a shower maybe once every 2 or 3 weeks, something like that. And clothing, well, we didn't smell too good, I'm sure, but we all smelled the same. And sometimes you wouldn't get a bath for 3 or 4 weeks.
Where were you on Christmas 1944?
I have no recollection of it. Christmas came and went, and we never remembered what it was. It was going on down in the Bulge, and we were up in the line, and I guess we were getting some kind of demonstrations from the Germans to hold us there, to make us think that they were probably just to keep us from moving around. And we had a bad time. We got shot up again, and Christmas came and went, and a couple days later I thought to myself, you know what, that was Christmas, wasn't it? So I never remembered that Christmas.
Did you ever get angry, or did you just get more orderly and organized about what your job was to be when you saw atrocities?
First, I never had any feeling of hostility or anger toward German soldiers. They were doing the same thing that we were doing. They were probably no happier about it than we. They didn't elect to go out there, but we didn't rationalize it in that way. If you sat any of us down, we'd try to sound like we were fighting soldiers or something. But in fact, we weren't all. We didn't have that feeling of hatred or anything. But when somebody's trying to kill you, soldiers are going to try to kill the other guy.
Yeah.
But no, we didn't have any. I never experienced any great kind of hatred. Again, most of the time, most of us were always so absolutely exhausted, David.
Yeah.
You just.
Just.
And it was cold. That was a bitter cold winter. I think it was one of the coldest winters it had in 50 years, something like that, during the Bulge. And the snow, my goodness, it was all over the place, and everything was white on the ground. If we moved, and the men couldn't dig a foxhole because of the frozen ground. So the engineers prepared for us quarter-pound blocks of nitro starch, which is sort of like TNT, with a pull type igniter on it. You could put that quarter-pound on the surface of the ground, pull the igniter, get behind a tree, and it would fracture the ice, so you could pick it off and then dig your foxhole.
Yes. When you came across the slave labor camp or the barn where they exterminated 1,000 slave labor workers, what was your reaction to?
My reaction was, I'd already gone into Stendhal, and next day one of the guys came in and was telling me about it and said, gosh, you got to go back and see that. And I remember telling the guy, I said, I'm not going back there. I've seen enough dead folks to suit me. But you have to think about what kind of beasts would do something like that. Of course, that was their criminal element that was in that, ran those slave labor camps. Those were essentially German criminals is what they were. It was a criminal organization.
Yeah. So you dissociated them from the regular German soldier?
Oh, totally. Yes.
Yeah.
The regular German soldier was just a good soldier.
Did you feel like it was one way of life battling another way of life at the time, or again was it just two armies fighting each other with soldiers?
As to to whether we had felt any political views or social views, I'd say not. I don't think so.
No.
I don't think so. I think all of us knew that it was the German government was a criminal government. I think everybody accepted that. After the war, we tended to feel that Germans civilians couldn't have done a whole lot about it anyhow, which they couldn't, and it's always crazy people who start wars, and I suppose that's what it was.
Did you ever feel that you were just luck of the draw that you didn't get killed and people that you knew did get killed? Or did you
If you stay in a forward area. Now there again, I was at a rank that I didn't have to dig a foxhole, get up out of the foxhole as an enlisted man did, and move forward with my rifle. But if you're in that forward area just long enough, you're gonna get hit. It's unavoidable. It's just a question of time.
No.
And do you feel that way? Yeah, you feel that, and I think you get a little bit inured to it. You just accept it and don't take any foolish chances that you don't have to take, and that's about it.
What kind of feelings do you have that you would like to impart to your children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren someday, because they're going to view this video at some point in time and say, hey, that's my great-granddaddy. What would you like to tell them?
Oh, I think I'd say in retrospect that don't ever expect to be a hero or celebrity or anything of the sort, but conduct yourself in such a way that, I've never thought of this before, conduct yourself in such a way that you never look back and be ashamed of yourself. I don't know that I could ever say that a person would be so self-centered as to look back and be proud of himself. I can't say that. But I think a person ought to have in his mind, I want to conduct myself so I'll never look back with that I'm ashamed of myself, I have regrets, remorse, but I simply, maybe it didn't work every time, but I simply did my best, and if I had to do it all over again, I'd do it the same way.
Well, Bill, I would like to express my personal appreciation to you on behalf of my generation and those after me for your allowing me to go to Eve River School while you were over fighting in the Battle of the Bulge and Miss Bloodworth's kindergarten there at the corner of Peachtree and Peachtree Battle, where I really was in school at those two places while you were overseas. And
we didn't know, we might have looked forward to having you come up and join us in a year or two.
my teachers tell me I could have killed a lot of people the way I behaved as a youngster. But we really do want to express our sincere appreciation to you.
I hope I haven't bored you too bad.
Well, you're a hero in our minds, and you may not be in your mind, and I can well imagine that your children and grandchildren will always look back and they'll be very proud of what you did and very unashamed of what you did.
Hope they're unashamed of it.
Thanks so very much.
Thank you, David.